Welcome. My name is Philip Banse, and welcome to dctp.tv from the conference. I only know it in German. Einbruch der Dunkelheit. My next guest is Eleanor Saitta. Welcome to the program.
Hi.
So you said you have no home. You're living nowhere.
Well, I have lots of homes. They just belong to all of my friends. I don't have a house right now, but that's just because I've been traveling a lot for work and that kind of thing, and it didn't really make sense to pay rent.
You don't even have a residential address anywhere, so you rent.
I have a mailbox and a storage unit, and that's plenty.
You don't miss anything?
I mean, it'd be nice to have access to my books, but that's about it.
And how come you travel so much?
I speak at conferences a fair bit and work on projects with people and that kind of thing. And to a certain degree, it's just like, oh, if I go to this place, there's this thing that I can get done if I'm there that I probably can't get done remotely. So
You call yourself a hacker? Why?
because it's a cultural affiliation and a professional affiliation. Hackers are people who explore technology, and what I really do is I'm a systems thinker. I look at how large complex socio-technical systems work, and specifically at how they fail, because failure modes tell us both a lot about how systems actually work and also at how we can change them to work in better ways.
An example, please.
So a lot of the work I do is in computer security. So, I spent 9 years as a commercial security consultant, and I might take a look at something like, say, an airline reservation system and say, oh, here's some set of vulnerabilities that, could cause problems. But increasingly, I've been kind of moving up the stack and saying, oh, well, here's issues at the workflow and business rules level within a system, or here's a similar set of issues but in a legal structure, or in sort of a combined social and technical system that might be, I don't know. Airbnb is an interesting example. It's not anything I've worked on, obviously,
Yeah.
but so there are technical, there's a technical system with the site, but there's also a set of cultural interactions, right? So that's a good example of kind of a socio-technical system.
And yesterday in your talk, you mentioned it's very important to think about say an online shop, how we design an online shop, and whether you want people to leave their name and address there or not.
Well, specifically what I was saying is that if you have a name field for a store, right, and you say, oh, there's a first name and a last name, you're assuming that all of your customers have a traditional first name and last name. There are a dozen or so different naming cultures around the world, some of which have name structures that are compatible with that, but many of which don't. So that even by making simple choices like that seem like purely technical choices, it actually has a political impact. It actually changes the structure. It imposes a thing on the world.
And why is it important to think about these kind of questions?
Because our actions shape the world around us, right? And this is one of the lessons that we've seen, especially recently, but just really over the past decade, is that there's no such thing as a purely technical system anymore. Every system has political effects. Every system has a political impact.
Can you provide some more examples that illustrate this kind of function?
So the decisions around what kind of surveillance structures one might build, like if you provide technical protection against surveillance in a system, or you choose not to for cost-saving reasons or whatever, this we've suddenly learned, this has a geopolitical impact, right? The decision to have many basic internet protocols unencrypted at the time was thought as this is mostly a technical consideration about internet security. Why should this be a political discussion? And we've realized that no, this is actually politics. This is actually a very important political discussion.
But how does the discussion or the decision making change when you realize, well, it's not only a technical question we're debating here, it's a political question. How does this change the debate or the reasoning
It doesn't change the reasoning, but it becomes a broader debate, right? It means that instead of looking purely at technical side effects, there's a much larger set of social outcomes that need to start being considered. When one needs to bring in all of those other things into the picture and say, oh, well, I understand very well that this will have a certain purely security-oriented impact, but what is it going to do to the shape of democracy, and it's not always going to start with a question that's that abstract. But for instance, there's a community wireless project that I'm doing some work with called Commotion, and we were talking about different technical security architectures for how low-level network configuration and management stuff is authenticated, right? So this is a very technical security conversation, but it actually turned out that we needed to have a discussion about the kinds of places where it might get set up, because if you're setting it up, for instance, in a refugee camp, which has a very central organized structure, then you need to support one set of kind of ways to authenticate and deal with stuff. Whereas if you have, say, a collective of a dozen churches and community groups that are providing wireless coverage for a community, that's a very different governance structure. And this has real political impacts on the communities that you set it up in. If you are required to have a single point of technical competence who controls the entire system, that's going to it's going to cause fights in that community as to who, which entity gets to be the one who's really in control of the system. And if that system ends up being core enough and important enough to the community, then over time that technical decision may actually shape the political structure of the community.
And can you think of a system we use today, we take for granted how it works today, and which would look totally different if the technicians and coders had, I don't know, thought about the political impact of their work?
I think the internet is that system, right? That there are a lot of security features that we would like to see in the internet now that aren't there. There are a lot of things that if we were designing the internet differently now, it would look very different.
For example?
End-to-end encryption, right? There's a lot of the mass surveillance we're seeing, and I mean mass, not targeted surveillance. There's a separate set of discussions there. But around this kind of dragnet, we're going to pull everyone's information in. That doesn't have to be possible. We can design the internet so that you simply can't do that. Similarly, the kind of structures of control that we see around sites like Facebook that have access to so much of our information, that control so much of our lives. The Facebook makes a little change in how many people a message reaches, and then all of a sudden NGOs or community organizations have real trouble in fundraising and that kind of thing, right? We might design systems so, that set of problems didn't arise.
But there are two questions that arise from this. First, what kind of internet would you envision if you had unlimited time and money and technical skills? How would it look like?
I want an internet which is much more peer-to-peer, which is much more a situation where everyone controls and provides their own services and provides services to each other, where there's no single central points of control and failure, and where we all get to kind of have a negotiated community discussion about what services do we want, and there's much more room for experimentation. I want to see an internet where we don't end up having to give all of our data to large companies. I want to see an internet that preserves freedom of expression, that governments can't abuse for their own political ends.
Okay. These are the broad aims. And can we rebuild the internet like that? Can we tweak and change it?
We are doing that. This is one of the things, and this is not, I think, as visible with a lot of the focus that's been on the political outcome of the Snowden revelations. But there's a massive set of technical work which is starting to happen. The Internet Engineering Task Force meeting in November in Vancouver,
which is a standardization
body that helps define a lot of the core internet protocols. It was basically all they talked about was wow, we really screwed up with some of the stuff because we didn't realize what the game was. It's time to fix that.
And I found that interesting because as far as I noticed, it was the first time that those engineers really considered political question and the political impact of their work.
It wasn't. So and this is actually one of the really interesting things of talking to some of the older folks who were around at the beginning of the internet and did the original design work. This is actually stuff they've been thinking about for a long time. They thought they lived in a nicer world, and a lot of them are furious that the politics and the intent of the internet that they built have been so heavily subverted. They built a thing with a certain intent, and what's happened to it is not okay, and they're going to fix it.
And does this mean that all the coder and the whole world of technologists will be more there will be less euphoria and more skepticism about what they're doing, because those guys in the beginning were very inspired, and we'll have an open internet and a global village and everything will be fine and we have world peace, and so everything is open, and that's how the technology looks like. And now what we've learned from Snowden and mass surveillance, now engineers start to think, well, we have to rethink everything.
I don't think the vision changes at all. Like, the vision is still of a single open internet. There are a lot of ways that we can provide that kind of freedom, that we can deliver on the vision. And, whether or not they were delivering on the vision, there's a complicated conversation there. But, that vision hasn't changed, and I don't think it needs to change from the mass surveillance. There are countermeasures that we need to put in place, but the entire point of those countermeasures is that we're not going to give up on the idea that the internet should be a place for everyone, that it should be open, that it should be free, that you should be able to say what you want.
And decentralization, some say balkanization, and a free open internet is not a contradiction.
Decentralization and balkanization are two completely different things, and this is a really, really important subject given where some of the reactions to Snowden are going, where they are looking at, let's create our own separate private internet. We're going to wall it off on national boundaries. That actually isn't decentralization. In a lot of cases, that means, like the Brazilian proposal, we're going to have a Brazilian service for Brazilians. All Brazilians should use their email here. Well, now you've created a single service provider that's, in some ways beholden to the Brazilian government. And, Brazil has surveillance too. Not at the same level, obviously, but that's actually making the problem, it's trading one bad problem for a potentially worse problem. Decentralization is the idea that you don't have single points of control. You don't have a single internet provider that everyone uses in any country or in any territory, or, a few large international companies. You have, as many internet providers as there are people receiving email or whatever. You have a completely different way of structuring these
and
things.
what kind of technical fixes do have to be applied for this to reach, so as to make a difference, not to end up with a balkanized internet, but to have a really free but decentralized internet? What kind of technical measures have to be done?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen at a technical level, but the biggest challenge is actually organizational, right? A lot of the two things that we need for a lot of this stuff is we need certainly all of the foundational code needs to be open source, because it needs to be trustable and auditable and transparent. And that is one of the fundamental underpinnings. And the other, and where this starts to conflict, is, if you look at where a lot of the code is written right now, it's written in sometimes startups, sometimes large corporations, but it's written in commercial enterprises. And we need a different model for funding the development of the internet that isn't based on advertising, because advertising requires the same centralization of control. There are a lot of ways that Silicon Valley is very complicit with Washington in creating the internet that can be surveilled. That doesn't mean it has to be that way. But so we need new business models, and we need new organizational structures that will let us create a different internet.
And how would they look like?
We don't know yet, and that's one of the big challenges. I mean, we have a lot of hints. Crowdfunding is a very interesting subject. There's a lot of different pieces that may end up coming together. I think in some ways this will mean that there are fewer services that are free in the same kind of way. It's not necessarily that they're going to cost a lot of money, because it turns out the return on investment for advertising is pretty low. These companies aren't making a lot of money per user. But yeah, that funding is going to get shifted around a bit. On the bright side, in a lot of cases, the funding model, if all you're trying to do is the software development, scales better than if you also have to do all the service provisioning and manage all the advertising. All that has a cost too.
So that will mean that we will pay, but more with money than with our data.
Yeah, and it's a different structure of control, and it's probably not going to look like I pay for single websites or whatever. It'll be, maybe, when I download a web browser, there's a please make a donation. Maybe you don't have to because it's open source, and that is part of the point of open source, is that it is free at that level too. But, there may be a strong, look, guys, we really do need you to make a donation or this can't happen. It'll be, it's a different social model, too, for how we understand what our responsibilities as citizens of the internet are.
Evgeny Morozov talked yesterday about this decentralization idea, and he said, well, we must not stop at saying, well, we have to decentralize the internet, but still our data is a commodity and others will pay for it, and unless we don't change the whole market and capitalist system, we won't solve this problem, and we will not control our data. What do you think about it?
I think that's his particular straw man. I don't see any reason why that should be the case. Yes, there are larger power structures that also need to be considered, but in a lot of cases, the appropriate place to consider the power structures that affect technology is within the scope of technological development. This is what I mean by technology is political, right? You have to think about the impact on those larger power structures, and when you build technology that supports the world that you want to live in. We need people who do technical development to actually have that kind of vision. And that does mean a shift in that role, but I am not convinced that a decentralized internet means that we're suddenly going to decide to bundle up our data and sell it off to the highest bidder on our own advisance.
So
this doesn't make any sense.
This is interesting, because when you say, well, technology has a political impact, on the one hand, it means you have to think about what your technology, what kind of impact does it have in society, but on the other hand, it means if you build the right technology, you can change society and also market structures willingly.
Yeah, technology shapes society, and society decides what it wants from technology, and there's a dialectic there. This is a structure. Tell me that the internet hasn't changed the structure of media expression. Of course it has. And I'm not going to say it was completely by design. A big part of technology is unintended consequences, but sometimes you can design some of those consequences.
Okay. Last part you mentioned, I wanted to ask you about a few questions. Is you said, well, we can learn a lot from the failures of systems.
Yeah. So failures teach us. Among other things, they teach us about unintended relationships within systems, dependency chains that we didn't realize were there. And you see, oh, weird, this thing over here broke, and then that broke, and that broke, and that broke. I wonder what happened there, right? And now all of a sudden you understand things that were not necessarily obvious. One of the other things is that you get structures. So failure modes are one of the places where the other things that technology does, the unintended consequences show up. That weird, when this system that we thought we were only relying on for one specific technical function broke, we suddenly started having a lot of internal coordination problems inside a company. Oh, we were actually using the information that was stored over here was a key part of project management or something, And so often you end up with these seeing technical failures or social failures that have technical.
Okay,
You
can you
get this
provide
back
an
and
example?
forth. I mean, so let's say you've got like as a trivial example, let's say you've got the file repository for a company, and it's used for a certain, like, I don't know, some kind of project status, and you realize that people are using file attributes or something to track, like sort by most recent file. Oh, now I know which list of projects is current, and like everyone was relying on that, and you make some change in the backup system or something, and then all of a sudden it breaks. So like it can be anything from a really trivial example like that to much more complicated.
Is there an example where you personally learned something from a technical failure about how, I don't know, how society works, or how this specific technology impacts society?
Some of the work that I've done in constitutional law was really interesting around looking at some of the bigger picture issues and saying, okay, what, if I design a structure of like court review of legislation in some specific way, what's it going to break? Under what circumstances might that review structure be problematic?
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. It was very interesting. Where can people find you on the net?
I'm Dymaxion on Twitter. That's Dymaxion. And I have writing and stuff online at dymaxion.org.
Okay, great. Check it out. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Philip Banse. You can check out other videos from this conference at dctp.tv. Thanks and have a nice day.